lately I've been playing a lot with toys like these. This is a Transformers toy, if you're not familiar. And, well, they're robots, but in disguise. And I bring this up because this IEM I'm reviewing, it's kind of a CrinEar IEM, but in disguise. Hey folks, I'm Mark Ryan. This is Super Review, and this is the Ziigaat Cross Hangout Audio Odyssey 2, which is an interesting IEM from a couple perspectives. Like one, it's just interesting that it's a collaboration between Ziigaat, which is kind of like a Linsoul brand, and Hangout Audio, which is like a competing retailer, at least I thought so. But if you're not familiar, Hangout Audio is Crinacle's retail brand. You can see that's Crinacle right there. I promise you. Which means that this IEM is kind of a Crinacle IEM, even though it doesn't have Crinacle's name on it. But it has a couple of implications for things like the build quality and, of course, the sound. And that's interesting. I have had this IEM for a couple of weeks now. I've been living with it, listening to it, comparing it with a couple of other IEMs, and I guess I'm ready to let you know what I think. For starters, what this IEM is, it's a hybrid set. It's a single dynamic driver, 3 balanced armatures, and I believe the price is going to come in at $250 US. The IEM is not, as of the moment of this recording, not actually on sale yet. I think by the time you see it, it will be on sale. So hopefully you can tell me if I'm right. But I think the price is 250 bucks. If it's not, I'll leave a pinned comment down below correcting myself. But yeah, a hybrid set, 250 bucks, kind of along the lines, frankly, of like the CrinEar Meta. And frankly, a lot of these meta-tuned IEMs, which I suppose is a bit of a spoiler that yes, the Odyssey 2 is another meta-tuned IEM, but we'll talk about the exact execution of it in a bit. Before we get to that, though, a quick shout out to Linsoul Audio for sending in the Odyssey 2 for review. If you want to check out the Odyssey 2, of course, I'll have them linked in the description down below. But with that said, let's go to the table. Let's talk about physical form factor, what you get inside the box, some packaging upgrades versus at least the last Ziigaats that I checked out. And then, of course, we'll talk about the sound on this IEM. So let me put that to the side. Here's the packaging. Kind of already showed it to you. It's got Crin's face on it, even though it doesn't have his name, although it does have his name in very small font if you look there. But apart from that, what you get inside of it is a carry case, which seems to be, I think, an upgrade versus the carry case that the other Ziigaats I've tried out have come with. It's just nicer build materials. It's a little bit large for me. Like, this isn't going to fit in my front pocket. Maybe if you wear cargo shorts, this will fit in your front pocket, but if you don't wear cargo shorts, you'll probably need a backpack or maybe just a coffee table. It is a nicely built case. You can see that it's got a nice felt padding, or kind of a, what do you call that? Velvet? It's kind of nice. But apart from that, here's what you get inside the box, which are fairly modest accessories, but frankly, all you need. I'll point this out before we get into talking about the ear tips. It comes with a spare set of filters, which is interesting. So this IEM, like a number of other similar IEM designs, has a kind of stick-on adhesive filter on the front. If that gets gunked up with ear gunk, dare I say, you can just pull that off with tweezers, plug on a new one. And I guess it's nice to include that. I'll say that I don't personally ever use these things, so you can avoid that fate. If that sounds intimidating, you don't want to pull off filters, you don't have to. Just keep your IEMs clean. But apart from that, you do get 3 different sets of ear tips, which is nice to see. I'm a big advocate of having multiple styles of ear tips so that you can test the fit and find what works best for you. There is a set of foam tips in small, medium, and large. Nice to see it available in all sizes, although I'm not a big foam tip person. But they do also include 2 different styles of silicone ear tips, one in this clear silicone and the other in kind of like the smoky. They're both a pretty similar material, kind of like a sticky, gummy, what do you call it, medical grade type silicone. I don't know that it's actually medical grade, but this is the type of silicone that you see often described as medical grade. And again, it's nice to see 2 different styles of silicone ear tips, although I will say that they are more or less the same shape. So you're not going to have drastically big differences in terms of fit and even sound impacts from these 2 different styles. At least I don't suspect you will. The one kind of caveat there is that the sizing is a little bit different on them. So the large in this darker ear tip is a little bit larger than the large in the clear ear tip. So you kind of effectively have 6 different styles or 6 different sizes of this fit of ear tip, which is to say, it's nice to see that in the box. Apart from that, let me put this stuff to the side. Let's talk about the build quality, physical stuff on the IEM itself, starting with a little termination swap. So it's nice to see that you do have swappable terminations. You can go between a standard 3.5 mil single-ended termination or a balanced 4.4 if you're into that. I'm going to say, however, There's a couple of things I don't love about this. For starters, this termination is just kind of a little bit too large. Let me show you another example in comparison here. This one's also swappable. And you can see that it's like a good centimeter shorter than this one over here. So it just ends up being a little bit long, which makes it a little bit extra cumbersome. And also I find makes it just a little bit more prone to accidentally, if you have this plugged into a digital audio player or even an amplifier, especially an audio player, if you put it in your pocket or something like that, having this be a little bit extra long just means I'm kind of worried about it breaking my audio player, to be honest. The other thing that I don't love about this mechanism is that there's no retention. It's just like friction fit. So you see that there's nothing like screws and holds this thing together, which is to say that, okay, well, it's a firm enough connection that for the most part, it's probably not going to be a problem. But I do find that sometimes, especially with 4.4, the connection with like a digital audio player is like so stiff that it ends up being stiffer than this connection. So if I try to pull out the termination by gripping onto this thing that appears to be a grip, it might actually leave part of the termination still plugged into your digital audio player. Basically, this comes disconnected unintentionally. I'll say I didn't have that problem specifically with this exact termination, but I have had issues with similar termination. So I bring it up and say that it's not my favorite solution, but again, it's nice that it is at least swappable. Now the rest of the cable, it's gonna leave a lot up to subjective personal preference. I think it is better than the stock cable I saw on the last Ziigaats I tried. I tried the last ones I reviewed were the Lush and the Arcanus. And they have like kind of like a thin, wiry, really kind of stiff cable. This one's similarly thin, and it is also similarly kind of memory prone. You can see like it wants to keep coiling itself back up, but it is a little bit softer. So I think that much is an upgrade. Although I'm not sure I'm a big fan of the green color. You make up your own mind on that. Like it goes well, I guess, with the IEM, which also has some green accents in it. But overall, I think I would prefer just a standard black cable. But you do have a nice small Y-split up here, and you have a chin slider that stays in place. I like to see that. This is actually a functional chin slider that won't reset every time you take the IEMs off. Seems like a small detail, but very few people actually seem to get it right. But the rest of the cable, it terminates into preformed ear hooks, pretty standard up here, as well as a pretty standard 2-pin connector. One thing I will point out about this 2-pin connector is you'll see that it does have a bit of a protrusion on here, even though the 2-pin connector on the IEM is not recessed at all. So that just means that when you plug it in, it does end up being a little bit taller than it probably needs to be. But I will say it didn't really end up being an issue for me. Usually like the potential downside of that is just that this cable, as it's wrapping around the back of your ear, it might not catch the back of your ear because it is being pushed up a little bit too far. But I don't know. Again, I didn't find it to be an issue so much with this one, probably because the chin slider stinking works, and that just adds enough tension to it. But anyway, apart from that, there are the earpieces, of course, and I'm gonna say that aesthetically, I'm not a big fan of this. And I don't know. I hate to keep harping on Ziigaat's IEMs in terms of their aesthetic, but I think they need an upgrade. I think the logo needs to be a little bit less spindly and thin, but also like this aesthetic is just kind of like they threw glitter on a faceplate, and well, there you go. There's your IEM. But that is kind of probably the one part of this IEM that is the same as other Ziigaats. The rest of the shell is actually a metal shell, which I don't think I've ever seen a Ziigaat with a metal shell. Usually they're a resin shell, and they have a similar shape. Like the shape is pretty similar to what you would expect. You know, kind of a semi-custom molded design. It is, I would say, medium in size. Like I don't think anyone's going to have, most people won't have issues with this thing being too large for your ear. And you see that it does have some, you know, semi-custom molded fitting, although it is also a little bit more generic in terms of its shape. So this should probably fit most people pretty well, but I don't know if it's going to fit anybody excellently, which I suppose I will demonstrate in a bit. But before I do that, just to highlight, the nozzle in it is actually a little bit on the short side, so it does fit a little bit shallow. And for that reason, for me, I sized up in terms of my ear tips, and maybe just kind of like a general tip when you are wearing an IEM that fits a little bit more shallow, consider sizing up an ear tip, because like your ear canal isn't the same. It's like a little bit narrower as it gets deeper, and then it's a little bit wider up top. So if you're getting a shallower fit, it makes sense that a wider ear tip might actually work out for you. Now, As for the nozzle itself, let me measure this thing real quickly. We should get about 6 millimeters on the nos, and that is at the lip. You see that it does have a lip for ear tip retention, which I like to see. And then down below that nos, you have about, a little under 5.5 millimeters, which is, I would say, a pretty standard nozzle diameter. If you're concerned about that size, I wouldn't be too concerned. Again, having even a slightly wider nozzle on a shorter nozzle, like if it's wider this way but shorter this way, it's going to fit less deep in your ear, and the width of that nozzle is going to be less of an issue. So I think for most people this should fit pretty comfortably, which it does for me. But again, it's not the most secure fitting because it's just not the most opinionated of shapes. Here in my ear, you can see that it is kind of a medium-sized shell, and it's all smooth edges around. Doesn't fit particularly deep. I would say that this is a comfortable fitting IEM. It does have, again, that little nub, that little semi-custom design there that catches this little nubbin in the ear called the antitragus, but there's not much back here to catch into these folds. So fit stability is, I found, just fine. I think probably if I had played around with ear tips more, I probably could have found something with maybe more of a ball, kind of like a ball joint design that would fit a little bit better and purchase onto the entrance to my ear canal here. I'm trying to show you there. So many things. But here with these more conical designs, I did find that in sleeping situation, which is kind of my ultimate test because I am not on a stage performer or doing anything physical activity with these IEMs, I sleep. And well, I did find that when I would sleep with these IEMs, they would kind of like work themselves out of my ear throughout the night. So yeah, not 100% stable, but comfort was definitely not an issue. So I think that's probably as much as I can tell you about the physical form factor on this IEM. So we should get into talking about the sound. Let me give this the old roadie wrap, make it look nice and tidy before I pull up the frequency response measurement as I've measured it on my rig. There you go, looking tidy. But yeah, let's go over here to Squiglink. Hold on. Let's go over here to Squiglink. Try that again. And this is the frequency response as measured on my rig. If you want to check it out, of course, I've got it linked on Squiglink, linked in the description. Down below there, you can compare this frequency response graph with literally hundreds of other IEMs that I've measured on my same rig with the same methodology. But what you can expect, we'll do a little bit of analysis here together. Let's ignore this bit down here and just kind of look at the top 3/4 of the frequency response. It's basically neutral. This is basically a tilted diffuse field sound signature, AKA the new meta sound signature, which is to say you have more or less a flat kind of lower mid-range, but it does somewhat tilt upwards in terms of the way we measure it here on the 711 rigs, at least. And that versus some kind of like the more classic like Harman tune, which is what you see with this lighter dotted line back here. This ends up to me sounding a little bit on the thin side, whereas having a more flat, upward tilted lower mid-range here makes it sound a little bit more full and frankly just more tonally correct to me. And I think that's exactly what we get here. Like this tonal balance is frankly just kind of fantastic across the board. And I think that this is like just a nice confirmation that this new meta sound signature is the direction that we should be pushing in. Even if maybe we're getting a little bit, I'm getting a little bit of fatigue from this tuning. Are you? I don't know. But yeah, I'd say up here, like in terms of the vocal, like this is kind of where you would expect, vocal forwardness, right? If it's a little bit overly strident here, you might have too contrasty of a vocal. If it's a little bit pulled back here, maybe a little bit recessed and a little bit masked in terms of its tonal balance. But I think it kind of just lines up just about right. Like it sounds not just in terms of its forwardness and like its position in the mix, but I think like the timbre of the vocal is actually quite well done on this, which is kind of what you should expect from a neutral tuned IEM. Now, what I'll also describe here is that the upper treble is, I'll say, tame. We'll talk about what that sounds like more to my ear, but if you're looking for an IEM that has a lot of boosted upper treble, you're not really gonna get that here on the Odyssey 2, and I don't think that that is a bad thing. I think this is actually something I probably should revisit with my target now that we're getting more IEMs that execute the treble like this. Is, I kind of expected I needed treble to be up about here to sound neutral, but honestly, this is sounding quite right, depending on how the rest of the frequency responses bounce. So we'll talk about that in a bit. But the last thing I want to talk about before we talk about the bass, and I will reveal the bass, is just A slight detail that you might not notice here, it didn't really stand out to me when I measured the frequency response, but the more I listen to it, I think that this is kind of impactful, is a slight increase in the treble between like 4 kilohertz to about 6 kilohertz here. Just a slight excessiveness in the treble that doesn't make it sound like overly strident. Again, it doesn't impact the tonal balance in terms of it sounding timbrally incorrect. But it does, to my ear, give this maybe a slightly thinner sound than you might expect from a more traditional tilted diffuse filled sound signature. It's not quite as warm and laid back as you might expect from if you have past experience with other IEMs with a similar tune. It does give it maybe more of a clinical, thinner sound. The last thing that I will, of course, talk about now is the bass here, which, of course, we've got a bass boost on here because everybody needs a boosted bass. And this is a pretty similar bass boost to what we see on a lot of these new meta sound signature IEMs, including Crinacle's CrinEar IEMs, right? The Daybreak and the Meta have a very similar bass boost in this kind of like lower mid-range into bass boost transition. The High Senior Mega 5 EST, very, very similar bass boost. We've got the now the nice HCK Rockies, very similar lower mid-range into bass. This is basically just kind of becoming the default bass boost to expect on a tilted diffuse filled sound signature. And what I will say about it is that you do get some elevated lower bass, but it is mostly sub-bass focused. It doesn't really, if you're looking for like something that's overwhelming bass, you're probably going to be disappointed with the bass execution on this. It is not overwhelming bass, but it's also like in terms of volume level, it's balanced enough that I don't find that it masks like the lower mid-range texturing or anything like that. It doesn't give you like the smeary bloated sound or anything like that. So I think the bass balance is good in terms of that aspect, but we'll talk about more, I guess, the subjective listening impressions when we talk about that, which we can talk about that now. So I'll pull up this IEM, I'll pull up my subjective listening notes just to kind of reiterate, like the tonal balance I think on this guy is actually quite nice. Maybe a little bit more contrasty than you might suspect from that new meta sound signature. Again, I'm attributing it to that kind of lower treble slight boost. Look, we're talking like 1.5, 2 decibels, but it's enough that it matters. And if you're not sure if this sort of thing matters, play around with EQ, add 2 decibels, add 1.5 decibels of treble from 4 kilohertz to 6 kilohertz. You'll notice the difference. It adds kind of like a slightly more clinical edge to it, maybe even a slight edginess to certain vocals, but it's not going to be to the degree that you're risking sibilance or stridency or sharpness or anything like that. So I think overall the treble is actually pretty well balanced. It does have like kind of a nice high def sound about it, which is something you don't necessarily get in all these sounds. We'll talk about one such comparison in a little bit. So it has like a nice incisiveness about it. It's not overly sharp, not overly aggressive. But it does have a nice sense of imaging. Sense the separation between instruments is good. Maybe not standout, but I think it's actually exactly where I would expect it to be and want it to be in terms of that aspect. Anything else? I mean, I'll say that the vocal balance is good. Texturing is pretty good, maybe a little bit on the smooth over side, and maybe it's just from that slight emphasis in the lower treble gives it maybe a slight artificial edge or just like a slight plasticiness. But I'm kind of picking nits there. Really, the bigger issue for me with this IEM is the bass boost, which is to say, like, the bass is not bad on this, maybe even better than some of the other new meta IEMs, but definitely not better than all of them. And frankly, I don't think any of them have really nailed the bass. And I think this is an example of another new meta tuned IEM that doesn't really nail the bass. It does have a decent amount of tactility and physicality behind it, but the word that I used to describe it, that I wrote down in my notes, is it's a little marshmallowy, which is to say it has kind of like a bounce to it, right? You can kind of, has a tactile bounce to it, but it also has kind of a softness and a pillowiness about its attack that just leaves it sounding a little bit unengaging, at least for the music I'm listening to. Like kick drums and stuff like that don't have that great of a kick and a wallop or anything behind them. If you're listening more to maybe electronic music that's more sub-bass focused, you might actually end up perfectly satisfied with the sound on this thing. But again, stuff with kick drums and stuff, I found just a little bit on the flat, kind of pillowy, weightless kind of side of things in terms of the bass. So yeah, just overall in terms of sound signature, I think that the tonal balance is quite nice. It sounds very natural, a little bit on the contrasty side, but also maybe just a little bit unexceptional. I don't know, maybe I'm getting a little bit of fatigue from this sound signature paired with this bass boost in that we've seen it, I don't know, like a half a dozen times or so in the last 8 months. And they're all kind of varying levels of degrees of good. And none of them are particularly exceptional yet. But how does this compare to a couple of other IEMs? Well, let me bring in a couple of other IEMs, including one I've been kind of subtweeting this entire review, which is the other Ziigaat IEM with a similar sound signature. This is the Lush. At least I think this is the Lush. It's the Lush. Similar driver configuration actually to what we get over here on the Odyssey 2, but this one's actually quite a bit cheaper. I think 170 bucks, maybe $180, I forget exactly, but it's a little bit cheaper, similar driver configuration, similar tuning philosophy, right? They're both going for this kind of new meta, down-tilted sound signature, but they actually in practice sound quite a bit different. So the Lush over here has, on a graph, it's gonna not look like a ton, but it's like a couple of dB recessed in that upper mid-range area, especially in that transition from, let's say, 3 kilohertz to 6 kilohertz, where this is maybe a little bit on the hot side. This is a little bit on the dark side. And even just that slight difference makes a big difference in terms of how they sound. The vocals on this thing, I think sound quite a bit more recessed, a little bit more pulled back in the mix, whereas here on the Odyssey 2, I think they are correctly positioned to my preferences. And then I'll also say that in terms of like resolution and definition, the Lush definitely comes across lower in terms of its resolution. It's a little bit smoothed over, a little bit blunted in its treble attack. And for some people, that's going to be what you're looking for. If you're looking for a really relaxed treble presentation, and just overall a really relaxed sound signature, that's what the Lush does well. For me, I find it ends up being a little bit unengaging. I personally prefer the more contrasty, well-defined sound that we get over here on the Odyssey. Again, it sounds more high def, where this sounds a little bit more low res. The one edge I will actually give to the Lush, not that its bass is fantastic, but I do find that its bass is a little bit more impactful in that mid bass, in that kick drum attack. It sounds a little bit more weighty and a little bit more satisfying on the Lush. Whereas here on the Odyssey 2, it's kind of a similar situation to what we get with a lot of these new meta tunes, which is to say, just a little bit pillowy and soft and maybe disappointing. But if you really don't want to be disappointed with your bass attack, you could consider this IEM, which is the Soft Ears Volume S. Also a hybrid set. Driver configuration is pretty similar, although I think this is kind of 2 dynamic drivers. One of them is a passive driver, and then I think 2 balanced armatures. And the price on this is actually a fair bit more at 320 bucks versus, again, I think $250. So this is the more expensive set, but in this head-to-head comparison, really for me, for my preferences, it's kind of not close. I really do prefer the Volume S just by leaps and bounds. That tactility in the bass that I say is lacking here in the Odyssey is what makes this IEM so engaging. And it's not because there's a ton of bass. Look at it in a frequency response, even just listen to the tonal balance. Maybe I would say that overall this sounds a little bit warmer than you get here on the Odyssey 2. Although it kind of depends on which area of the frequency response your ears are focused on. But I think overall I do get a fuller sense of the mid-range. Sounds a little bit fuller, a little bit lusher, I suppose, versus this sounding a little bit more on the clinical side. But really the big difference for me is just how tactile and physical the sound is on the Volume S. And it's not just the bass, which I do think is a big difference, but also even in like the mid-range. I think the mid-range vocals and stuff like that come across to me more textured and just a little bit more, I don't know, just a little bit more special and kind of like a Sennheiser HD600 sort of way. Whereas over here on the Odyssey 2, again, sounds just a little bit too clinical and maybe a little bit more exacting, I suppose. But some people are definitely going to prefer this. For me personally, however, the Volume S is definitely the winner. But I think that is probably enough of talking about these IEMs. Let's wrap it up and give this thing a score. The Ziigaat Cross Hangout Hangout Odyssey Audio? No, I can't say this. I need to stop trying. The Odyssey 2, out of 5 stars. I'm going to give it a solid 3 stars out of 5. This is a good IEM, a very good IEM. In fact, if I hadn't heard the other 6 or so new meta IEMs over the past 8 months, I would probably be a lot more excited about this IEM. But as it is a very good IEM that is starting to, however, blend into the mix of a number of other also very good IEMs. It's a little bit unexceptional in a way. I do like it better than the Lush, but yeah, I think if you're going to spend this much, I personally would just save up for the Volume S. That said, if you want to check out the Odyssey 2, of course, I've got it linked in the description down below. And while you're down there, if you haven't yet, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, ding the YouTube bell, join me in Discord, also linked in the description, and I'll catch you in the next super review. Cheers.
Join with the force of reviews, we now have the tools to brave the misleading world of audio fools. Hey, this review is super, and so are you. Grab your headphones, sniff a graph, and share your thoughts in this pursuit. Let's get into the future.